My name is Lilia Opresk. I am Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today, both here physically at Bergen Global, but also online, to talk about this very important topic of forcible deportation of Ukrainian children by Russia. You know, the coming Monday will mark 3 years since the start of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And last year we had an event at this very place, 10 years of Russia's war against Ukraine, because as you know, it started in 2014 with annexation of Crimea and start of the war in eastern Ukraine. However, in reality, we could actually be talking about centuries of Russian war against Ukraine. Because Ukrainians and also researchers who actually research Ukraine, they would see this as continuity of the colonial policies and systematic denial of identity of Ukrainian people as well as agency of Ukrainian state. So today we will aim to bring historical perspective to what we are talking about because it is necessary to grasp the gravity of crimes committed by Russia at the present moment. And I'm honored to welcome on the stage with me the experts in the various topics. On my left, I have Julia Joffe. Julia is Associate Professor in Law at University College London. Julia previously was Postdoctoral Fellow in Children's Rights at Queen Mary University London and Researcher in International Refugee Law at University of Oxford. Julia also clerked at the International Court of Justice and worked for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, representation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the regional representation for Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian Red Cross Society. Next to her, I have Svetlana Arabadze. Svetlana is Postdoctoral Fellow at the Department of Archaeology, Conservation and History at the University of Oslo and Associate Professor at the Department of History and Archaeology at Mariupol State University, where she teaches a course on the history of the Greeks in Ukraine. Svetlana currently works on the EU Marie Curie funded project with the title Becoming Greek South of Ukraine, the history of Ukraine through its Greek minority between local and transnational context. Svetlana is currently working on a monograph on the history of Mariupol as a port city. Next to Svetlana, we have Ingun Lunde. Ingun is Professor of Russian at the University of Bergen with research interest in social cultural linguistics, language policy, East Slavic medieval culture, and contemporary Ukrainian literature. She is the author of Verbal Celebrations, Kirill of Turov's Homiletic Rhetoric and its Byzantine Sources, Language on Display, Writers, Fiction and Linguistic Culture in Post-Soviet Russia, and Fragmentera fortid, Historiens rolle i russisk samtidslitteratur. Ingun was managing editor of Skandoslavica and is founder and editor-in-chief of the book series Slavica Bergensia. Ingun is also a literary translator from Ukrainian and Russian into Norwegian. And next to Ingun, we also have Gayane Nurijanian. Gayane is Associate Professor in Law at the Arctic University of Norway. She holds an LLM from the University of Cambridge and a PhD from University College London. Gayane previously worked as a lawyer at the European Court of Human Rights and the International Advisory Panel on Ukraine at the Council of Europe, as well as the International Criminal Court. So we will start our panel discussion and open for questions later on. So both of you joining us online can write the questions in the chat, and you are very welcome, audience here, to raise your questions also. And I would like to start with the story of Vitaly. Vitaly is a 16-year-old from Ukraine. Vitaly lived in Bereslav. This is a small city in the Kherson region of Ukraine. This is South Ukraine. It's on the right bank of the Dnipro River. The city of Bereslav was occupied by Russia on 21st of February 2022. It was later recaptured in November 2022 by Ukrainian forces. However, parts of this Kherson region left bank of Dnipro River. They are under occupation still, and they are under daily attacks from Russia. But back to Vitaly. During the city's occupation in autumn 2022, Vitaly was taken by the administration of his school to a camp in Crimea, which, as we know, has been occupied by Russia since 2014. He was taken there for so-called rehabilitation. But when children arrived in Crimea for this rehabilitation, they were told something else. And I quote, "You are at an orphanage, your parents don't need you, Ukraine doesn't need you." So Vitaly was told that he would be transferred to Pskov in Russia and be adopted. Well, luckily, the efforts of Ukrainian NGO to return forcibly transferred children were successful, so Vitaly reunited with his family in March 2023 and was able to tell us his story. And this is just one of many stories which have been shared publicly, and imagine also stories which have not been shared publicly. So I want to turn, Julia, to you with the question. Could you tell us a bit more what is happening, and is Vitaly's story a typical one we are talking about today?
Thank you so much, Lydia, for a kind introduction, and also for talking about Vitaly. It is one of the stories and representative of one of the groups of forcibly transferred children. But before I talk about different categories, I'll just want also to let everyone know about the scale, because I think a lot of people think it's just one or two children that are caught in the war and in these circumstances, but it's actually the forcible transfers of Ukrainian children are in thousands, if not in 100,000s. So we noticed from credible reporting since the full-scale invasion, since February 2022, that children were forcibly transferred, and this practice was extensive and systematic. We do not know the exact numbers. Different sources provide different numbers. Ukrainian side quotes numbers in around 20,000 children, and you can check this information from the government website, Children of War. But basically, these are children whose parents provided documents and contacted the authorities, went through all the procedure to find the children. So you can imagine that this is a lot smaller number than it is in real life. However, Russian side actually quotes higher numbers. For example, Maria Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia, she says that more than 700,000 children have been forcibly transferred, although they call it evacuation, and it's in best interest of the children, etc. So the numbers are quite different, but it's clear that the practice is systemic and widespread. But it's also important to note, as Lydia mentioned, that the war started in 2014, and unfortunately forcible transfer of children also started in 2014, but the scale, of course, increased in 2022. In terms of the categories of children who are being transferred, so in my research, I identified 5 main categories. First category, it is institutional transfers, so children from boarding schools, from orphanages and hospitals. And it's important to know that in Ukraine, children in orphanages and boarding schools, most all of them are not true orphans. They're there for social and economic reasons, so they do have family members, but they were just deported as collectively as orphanages and boarding schools. And similarly in hospitals, if during the occupation a child happened to be in the hospital, for example, awaiting the surgery, even if they had children, they were just captured and sent to Russia and put for adoption. This particularly happened in Kherson region. The second category is what you mentioned, it's a Vitaly story. These are children who are sent to so-called holiday camps, but they're actually re-education camps. And these are children where Russian occupying authorities would come to occupied families, and in coercive environments, usually also with guns present, ask parents to allow children to go for a holiday for 2 weeks, but then they never return from that holiday. And we found out that these are not actually holiday camps, these are re-education camps where there is military training and also a lot of Russification. I think Vitaly also shared that they were forced to sing Russian anthem, Ukrainian flags were burned, they were beaten for mentioning Ukraine or any patriotic feelings. So this is quite intense, and also after that they're brainwashed into thinking that their parents don't need them and don't want them, and they are sent for adoption by Russian parents. So Vitaly is one of the lucky ones, unfortunately, who was returned. And among all these thousands of children, the only children that are returned is this category where they were sent for holiday camps, because mothers, usually mothers or parents of these children, bravely travel to Russia with NGOs and basically try to get back by bribes, etc., in all possible means these children back. But unfortunately, I think it's around 300, 400 children that were returned this way. So it's great that they're back, but it's also a very small percentage. Other categories are children that are, the third category, children who are separated from parents in filtration process. So filtration is an occupation policy of Russian Federation, where they are trying to identify individuals that collaborate with Ukrainian authorities or have pro-Ukrainian views. There are a couple of cases we know for sure that a parent was detained indefinitely and children were sent to Russia and then sent for adoption by Russian parents. But we don't know the scale of it, because Russia doesn't allow any human rights bodies monitoring there. There are, of course, children who are separated in the chaos of war, in the battlefield. And again, if Russian authorities come across any unaccompanied children, they capture them and send to Russia and send them for adoption. And there are quite a big number of children with families that the entire families are sent to Russia, and they do not have an opportunity to go to Ukraine because humanitarian corridor to Ukraine is either closed or attacked. So they're forced with their parents to be sent to Russian territory. So these are broadly 5 categories. Vitaly is in the second category, and these are the only children I know of that have been returned. But it's not only the forcible transfer, there is a huge element of indoctrination. So I've mentioned some of the education camps. So basically these children are put in Russian schools. There is no option of Ukrainian school. They are forced to be taught in Russian language, in Russian curriculum. Russian curriculum has also been changed quite a bit in recent years, where there is a significant element of military education and patriotic education, where Ukrainian children have to learn that Ukraine is a fake Nazi state and that actually Russia liberated them and prepared them for the war with the Nazi, which basically means with their own family members. These children also are prevented to keep in touch with Ukrainian family members. They're told they don't care about them. Also, the names of the children are changed and they're dispersed all over the country to prevent family reunification. They are sent for adoption. Actually, Russian parents are paid a lot more for adopting Ukrainian parents, so there are financial incentives. And Russian parents also have to go through ideological education to be able to adopt Ukrainian children. And unfortunately, we now know more about the military element specifically, that especially teenage boys are sent to military camps, particularly in Chechnya, and they are basically being prepared to serve on the front lines of the war on the Russian side, which is a separate war crime.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia, for expanding on what is happening. And it's very important that you mentioned this is also happening since 2014, right? Because parts were under occupation since then. And I think it's also important to remember that as long as Ukrainian territories remain occupied by Russia, which is a lot since 2022, those children are in danger of being transferred to those camps, right? So it is very important for Ukraine and for Ukrainian society that the territories are being returned back to Ukraine, because it's not the land, it's people who are there and what they are subjected to. So the longer those parts stay occupied, the more danger there is that this is what's happening to the children. We have thousands of Ukrainian children being caught in under the Russian occupation. But before we continue, I just have a quick question to Ingun, because Julia mentioned re-education in Russian language, and just this week I had a presentation and I talked about literature in Ukrainian, and then I got a question. Could you please explain what does it mean, literature in Ukrainian? Isn't Ukrainian a dialect of Russian? So I needed to explain a bit. So maybe Ingun could, as a linguist, could explain us what is the difference here.
Yes, so the question is Ukrainian a language is a very simple question, and it can be answered in a very simple way. of course, we all know the answer. But it is tempting to bring in a famous definition by the linguist Max Weinreich, who defines a language as a dialect with an army and a navy. And in this sense, I think Ukrainian overqualifies, since Ukraine has won the battle of the Black Sea without really having a navy. But the point of Weinreich, of course, is that it is to a certain extent, or to a great extent, a political question. So I think we all agree that Norwegian is a language and not a little Swedish dialect of the great Swedish language. And now I'm using an equivalent of the imperial terms used to describe Ukrainian and Russian. But to return just for a moment to the linguistic question, I can point to my own experience that I have worked a lot to learn Ukrainian, even, and I'm still in this process, even if I knew Russian from before. And even if this is a political question, it also has a linguistic dimension. So Ukrainian and Russian are different languages. Norwegian and Swedish are much closer. And it's sometimes difficult to measure differences, but because languages can differ structurally, and they can differ, but something that is possible to measure is vocabulary, so what words we use. And in that sense, Ukrainian and Russian have 62% shared vocabulary, which means that the rest is not shared. While, for instance, Polish and Ukrainian is closer, 70% shared vocabulary. But what is really interesting, if we return to the political question, and I think we can talk more about this later, is that if we look at the conditions under which Ukrainian has established itself, developed, and is being maintained as a fully functional modern standard language, it is quite impressive that Ukrainian is this fully functional modern standard language that is used for everything from writing poetry to writing laws, because Ukrainian has been systematically repressed through centuries, in particular by Russian authorities. So I should like to answer your question by saying not only yes, Ukrainian is a language, but Ukrainian is a language with a particularly strong linguistic resilience.
Thank you very much, Ingun, and I should just compliment you on your Ukrainian skills. So in Ukrainian, please talk to Ingun in Ukrainian. You will be amazed how well she talks Ukrainian, and it's very inspirational for Ukrainians to see, of course, foreigners actually learning the language and able to communicate it. So, thank you. But I would like to return to you, because in your research you mentioned that the recent actions taken by Russia in the course of its invasion, that they bear similarities to the pattern of colonial violence and oppression historically inflicted upon Ukrainians by the Soviet Union and also the Russian Empire. Could you please elaborate on this a bit?
Sure. So in my research about current forcible transfers, I think the most common question, especially in Western audiences I've received, was, well, but why Russia would do it? This comes out of nowhere. Why would they deport children in thousands and then Russify them? This doesn't make sense. But unfortunately, again, for Ukrainians and anyone who is familiar with the region or someone who is from former Soviet Republic, I think a lot of it just reminded them of previous colonial and imperialist practices of Soviet Union and Russian Empire. I'm sure colleagues will talk about it more, particularly with Russification, which has started in 19th century in Russian Empire, and it was imposed on not only Ukrainians but other ethnic minorities and nationalities. So, for example, also Poles and Lithuanians suffered from this. Apart from Russification, so basically imposing Russian language, Russian culture, but also Orthodox Church, there was an attempt to eradicate any cultures, languages, and educations in those languages. And of course, there were also ethnic cleansing and deportations, again in 19th century, particularly in Caucasus and Central Asia. And this was all explained by this unreliable ethnic minorities or national minorities that resisted the centralized empire. And unfortunately, this practice carried on in Soviet Union. And we know that, well, both the Imperial Army in the First World War, but also the Red Army in the First World War, when they occupied Kiev, or Imperial Army occupied Galicia, their practices actually have very scary parallels with what happened, for example, in occupation in Kiev Oblast, in Bucha, Irpin in 2022. So complete erasure of Ukrainian language, culture, changing names of the street, destroying Ukrainian press, prohibiting Ukrainian language, burning Ukrainian books. So you just read the accounts of again, occupation of Galicia or of Kiev in 1917-18, and it's word for word what happens now, hundreds years after. And again, for better half of Soviet rule, again, it's not only Ukrainians, other nationalities, ethnicities that were deemed to be unreliable or which resisted imperial power, wanted their own state or national identity protected. They were deported in millions. The Russification intensified. Some of the deportation policies also led to Holodomor, which we will probably discuss more. In 1930s, a man-made famine, not only in Ukraine but also in Kazakhstan, where millions, over 3 million Ukrainians died. And the argument is for exactly resisting erasure of Ukrainian identity. Similarly, again, it's not only Ukrainians. For example, women and children in Baltic states after 1940s have been en masse deported to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and they were not, and this is the same for Ukrainians and the nations from Baltics and other nations. They were not only deported, many of these people died en route or because of the conditions in Siberia and in difficult conditions they had to live. There were already examples of forcible transfer of children, for example, in within the Siberian indigenous communities. Children were separated from parents and sent to residential schools where they were not allowed to speak their own languages. They were not allowed to wear their national clothes, so they again were Russified. And interestingly, that Russia has been doing it, the Soviet Union, from 1940s, but when the Genocide Convention that we potentially will talk about today, when it was drafted in 1940s, the Soviet representative, when there was a discussion of the provision about forcible transfer of children and whether it should be genocide, Soviet Union representative said, but what is this practice? We've never heard about this before, while they were at that time separating Siberian indigenous children, also people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, etc. So we see this sort of preceding practice of deportation, ethnic cleansing, Russification, and a lot of it just reminds us of what's happening now. And of course, the forcible transfer of children, this practice is not unique to Russia. I think there is a good argument to be made that a lot of colonial powers used forcible transfer of children to deal with minorities that didn't want to integrate or be part of the empire. So there are a lot of parallels, for example, how with indigenous children in residential schools in Australia, the US, and Canada, and just through human history.
Yeah, thank you, Yulia, for giving us the background and some historical background to it, and also for highlighting that we are talking not only about Ukrainians in historical perspective, because also, as we know, Ukraine as a state today, it's not homogeneous, right? We have different ethnocultural groups. Just to name one, like probably well known nowadays, the deportation of Crimean Tatars during the Soviet time is probably one of the most well-known cases on the Ukrainian territory in this time, but there were a lot of transfers happening also after the Second World War in the western Ukraine and Polish population, for instance. and Ukrainian as well. And now, Svetlana, I want to turn to you, because you research the Greek community in Ukraine, in particular in the Azov Sea region. And Azov Sea region, it's a region around the Azov Sea, obviously, and it includes Donetsk region, so parts of it were already occupied since 2014. And since Crimea is also next to the Azov Sea, now the whole region around Azov Sea is occupied by Russia. So from your perspective of Greek community in Ukraine, do you see historical parallels between what is happening now in the Azov Sea region and what was happening back in the Russian Empire, the Soviet times?
Thank you, Lilia. There are historical parallels, and the Greek community is one of example of both deportation and also Russification policy. The Greeks were deported by Russia from the Crimean Peninsula. It happens in 18th century, at the end of the 18th century. And Russia deported not only Greeks, but also Armenians and other Christians to economically weaken Crimean Khanate. The Crimean Khanate is a state that existed on the Crimean Peninsula since 15th century. And in official literature, it was described as it was a liberation of Crimea's Christian population of the Muslim oppression. While the Crimean Khanate was a Muslim state, but it was a religiously tolerant state, and Greeks, as other Christians, didn't wish to leave. So in reality, it was, of course, not liberation, it was deportation. And after being resettled, the Greek community was granted some privileges, but they were not allowed to return to Crimea. So for them, it was forbidden even after the Russian Empire occupied the Crimean Khanate and incorporated in their state. So for Greeks who tried to return and couldn't understand why they still couldn't come back home, the Russian authority found people who tried, and they were all returned to their new place of residence. So this resettled population were settled in Mariupol, and where previously Ukrainian population had lived, so they resettled Ukrainian to another place and settled there Greeks, and also Greeks formed the Greek community in the city and also established 21 villages not far. So it was close Greek community, quite big at that time on the Azov Sea region. And after the introduction of the school reform in the Russian Empire in 1864, the population of the Russian Empire was allowed to take initiative in opening primary school if a local community could afford it, because they needed to pay some money. But the main specific of this education was that education was requested to be conducted only in the Russian language. So as the Greek children didn't speak at all Russian, they had additional year just to learn Russian language, and after that they started their education. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it was a significant part of Greek men who could speak Russian, whereas fewer women did, because it was a tradition that for girls it's not really necessary to go to school. So in a Greek family they were more rarely sent to the school, and it helped Greek families to preserve their language, because when children come back to school they continue to use their mother tongue at home. So it was like a first step of the Russification policy during the Russian Empire time, and the most significant changes happened after the Russian Revolution. The Soviet authorities they tried to demonstrate loyalty to the ethnic minorities and tried to showed that their policy is completely different to the Russification policy of the Russian Empire for the first time. So aiming to sway the population of different ethnic groups on their side, they start to create national, territorial, and administrative unit in 1920s. And due to that, in Mariupol also was formed several national Greek territorial units. And on these territories, ethnic minorities were allowed to develop their culture and their language. So Greeks established schools with their language of instruction, reading room, courses, Greek language courses for teachers. Even a Greek department in pedagogical college also was established. The Greek the local newspaper Kollektivistis was published in Greek in Mariupol. Even Greek theater was open. So it was a time of cultural revival. But of course, this cultural revival didn't last long, and the Soviet policy started to change in the 1930s. In 1932, all the national administrative territorial unit, they were liquidated. And after, with this forced withdrawal of grain and food, and also collectivization, the famine started in 1932. And with the end of the famine, also the policy of support ethnic minorities also ended. So from this time, schools, clubs, everything that connected with this policy of Hellenization, as it was called for Ukrainian people, it was called Ukrainization. So it was stopped, and all the Greek intelligentsia that appeared during this period, teachers, poets, musicians, all of them were repressed. And of course, all mentions about Greek heritage, they were abandoned. And the most significant change happened in 1937, when Greek population was accused of establishing a nationalist organization that aimed to create a bourgeois fascist state in a territory where Greek resided. Of course, it sounds strange, but of course it was complete. It was lie, but it led to the accusation of Greek, and around 4,000 people, Greeks, only in Donetsk region, were arrested, and after they were sentenced to death by shooting. Just imagine that 97% of these people who were arrested, they were killed. And only 3% just was sent to Siberia or to labor camp as Gulag. So it was very lucky people, how they call it, because most of the people were killed. And this repression, of course, all intelligentsia, all teachers, so all people who were actively developed Greek culture during the previous period, they were killed. And mostly in every fourth family, Greek family, someone was repressed. And if we compare the numbers of people who were killed during this repression, and Greek, this repression is killed is named as Greek operation. So the Greeks has the highest percentage of execution. So among other nationalities in the Soviet Union. So Greeks were terrified. So it was very difficult period, and from this time, Greeks know that with a Greek nationality mark in their passport, it's very dangerous for them. There is no career opportunities. It's possible consequences because they are Greek, and they knew that they were repressed just because they were Greek, because they established a Greek organization with aim to create this bourgeois fascist state. And from this time, Greeks started to change their surname because it was very important to become Russian, and it was very easy to do. So you just adding the ending of, and now your surname sounds like Russian. So my relatives, I have ancestors, my Greek ancestors, some of them, for example, I give you some example only, changed their surname in such way. So his surname was Chelach, it's mean left-handed, and just ending off, he became Chelachov. And this family, in their children document, certificate of birth and passport, there was information that they were Russian, despite the fact that both the parents were Greek, because for children it was more safe to be Russian. So in Greek, in a lot of Greek family from this period, parents hardly ever told their children about their past and what their relatives had experienced in the first part of the 20th century, just to protect children, because in this case they couldn't tell someone about their relatives and what happened. Maybe someone was repressed. So in this case, your people's enemy, or your relatives of the people's enemy. So the second half of the 20th century is a period when, especially in the city of Mariupol, Greeks didn't speak Greek. So they raised their children only in Russian just to protect them. And I, to be honest, heard Greek language only when I came to the village to my grandmother. In other case, no, only Russian, and no one teach me. So it was okay, you don't really need it. And all question about repressed relatives, etc., they just avoid. So grandparents still felt this fear that maybe they could give me the information that in the future will harm me. So after Ukraine gained independence, it was completely other time. So ethnic minorities received opportunity to develop their culture. So it's also time of rise of Greek culture in Mariupol and villages that are around. But since 2014, as you know, Russia claimed that they tried to protect Russian-speaking population in occupied territories, despite the fact that Greeks also became the Russian-speaking population only due to the repression politics of the Soviet Union and Russian Empire. So, and now more than 90% of Greek territories, I mean villages that were established by Greek, they are occupied. And a lot of Greeks who managed to left Mariupol 3 years ago, they couldn't return to their home now. So it's very similar situation that happened more than 200 years ago.
Thank you, Svetlana. I will ask a question to Ingun, so we will return a little bit to the situation nowadays. Because Vitaly, whose story we have heard at the very beginning, he also recalls, and I quote, "We were forced to stand for the Russian national anthem. We were forced to learn the song Russia Onwards. They said we need to forget the Ukrainian language. They said there would be no such language." So Ingun, could you please just elaborate a bit more on what is happening in terms of language in Ukrainian territories occupied nowadays?
Yes, so Julia already mentioned that the Russification, we can call it Russification, is both about content and about the form and the language of instruction in particular. So Ukrainian history is replaced by Russian history. Perhaps it is called the history of the fatherland, but implying then that it is history of Russia. Ukrainian language literature replaced by Russian literature, Ukrainian language books replaced by Russian books, en masse, and so on. And the language of instruction then becoming Russian, and perhaps for a time. So this is a process which has sometimes been called a playbook, a occupation playbook, often accompanied by official statements and even laws in Crimea, for instance, 2014, and also in the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Both Ukrainian and Russian, and in Crimea, Crimean Tatar, are defined as state languages, but in reality we have this process going on, where then gradually Russian takes over as a language of instruction. Perhaps there are still some hours of Ukrainian language per week, then this is reduced. Perhaps they are placed at very, very odd times, scheduled in the morning on Fridays, for instance. Then they are no longer compulsory. Parents have to make a choice for their children to study Ukrainian, and as we know, this is dangerous, just to signal that you want your children to learn Ukrainian. And in the end, there is no Ukrainian language left in education, and very often then the official statements are that this happens due to lack of parents' demand. So I kind of trying to present this as a popular as the will of people, and I think also that you spoke about these camps. They also have camps for teachers in order to make teachers of Ukrainian into teachers of Russian, and also I've observed that there is a kind of very strange but typical double-bind communication strategy about this, where on the one hand we see a kind of appreciation about the beautiful historical Ukrainian language, or sometimes it is called a Kievan dialect or something like that, on the one hand, which is kind of very, very similar to the way Ukrainian was described in Imperial Russia. For instance, Russian member of parliament Yevgeny Fyodorov said in September 2022 that the Ukrainian language is an indispensable part of Russian culture. And if it is taught, it has to be taught in a form that the Russians want to define themselves. So they speak about some mysterious classical Ukrainian language, and that there are now being produced or made textbooks in this language. So this is the one aspect, and then the other one is a constant rhetorical campaign to discredit this language as being something artificial, something a symbol of Russophobia, as the famous Russian film director Nikita Mikhalkov called it, a statement repeatedly echoed in the Russian mass media, or even as having this inherent Nazi ideology. So in the autumn of 23, there was a big conference in Donetsk called Denazification, Past and Present, specifically about society, language, culture, with a huge session on language, 30 papers, short communications, and the title was "The Russian Language as a Foundation for the Formation of a Russian Identity in the Process of Denazification of Ukraine." So Ukrainian is kind of represented in this Russian perspective as something artificial, called all kinds of things. The most extreme, perhaps, a Canadian dialect, authored by Banderites in Canada. And this is a quote, where Western Ukrainian dialect was harmonically filled up with rotten Anglicism, Polonisms, Germanisms, and other isms, just not Russian ones. And if we are to speak about parallels here, this is also, I think, a very typical Russian strategy in the propaganda, that they refer to something, some historical process perhaps, that they either don't understand or don't want to understand, and then makes a big propaganda thing out of it. Because we can think of what Svetlana was talking about, the 20s, where non-Russian languages, cultures were promoted within this context of Karenizatsiya, Ukrainizatsiya, and so on, a policy that allowed for the development and promotion of non-Russian cultures. Also, Ukrainian linguists were very active in defining and developing the Ukrainian standard language, and we had this famous new orthography in 1928, the Kharkiv orthography for contemporary Ukrainian, which was also an endeavor to make Ukrainian a little more Ukrainian by removing some Russianisms and some Polonisms, which is a very, very normal thing to do. Most countries do that. Some countries do more of it, like in Iceland or in France. Some do less. But it is a very, very common thing to do when you work to develop and maintain your standard language. And then, of course, as Svetlana also talked about, this process was discontinued, this whole space of possibility, so to speak, to promote non-Russian languages. And this orthography was also discontinued and replaced by a Soviet, highly Russified Ukrainian orthography of 1933, where even one letter was removed as being too Ukrainian. So this whole process then is kind of perhaps reflected, I think, in this propaganda history of propaganda topic, classical topic of describing the Ukrainian language, and also the very need that obviously occupation authorities see, that they not only prohibit this language, but they also see a need of reserving the right for themselves to define what it is.
I was just wanted to ask you about the parallels to the Russian Empire, like the Soviet Union. You already addressed some of it, but I was thinking about the bans on Ukrainian language. If you would like to,
yes, that is also, of course, a current theme, and also Svetlana touched upon it with these educational reforms, which made Russian obligatory. So when it comes to Ukraine, there are several important processes and instances. The most famous one is the 1863 Valuyev Circular, which prohibited the use of Ukrainian, particularly in education, which is relevant for our context. It was a reaction also to the Polish uprising of 1863, and this was a time where Ukrainian people of culture and education were very active, in fact, in promoting literacy among peasants, and doing so in Ukrainian also. Several primers were printed, Ukrainian language primers. So this law targeted specifically these endeavors. And again, and this is very well known to all Ukrainians here, but the wording of this law is so typical. So let me just quote the definition here. There was not, is not, and cannot be any Little Russian language. So Little Russian is the imperial term for Ukrainian. Their language, used by the common people, is the same Russian language, only corrupted by the influence of Polish. And again, this need and will to define something and then even prohibit it. It's something that does not exist, which we also see very clearly today. So that's the most famous, perhaps, instance of prohibition of Ukrainian. I think, Julia, you also mentioned in Galicia in 1914, where you have a kind of repetition of the whole Valuyev and later M's decree. Also, these regulations were made permanent in 12 years later, and expanded to also to prohibit the import of Ukrainian language books. If we have time, one final example, okay? And this is a little earlier, and I think it's also interesting when we speak about this combination of the content and the form, so the language and what is said in this language. Because, I mean, one of the many absurd things about Putin's claim that this is about the liberation of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is this is the place where you can speak Russian about anything. You can say what you want in Russian, which is not the case in Russia. So this content and form is interesting. And if we go back a little earlier than the Valuyev circular, this law against Ukrainian, we can look at how this national revival, as in many countries at the time, you have this interest for your own culture, Ukrainian culture, folklore, gather material, study this material in the early 1800s, which became dangerous as soon as this Ukrainian language endeavors also contained new political ideas. So an interesting example here is Taras Shevchenko, the national poet and wonderful artist, who wrote in Ukrainian addressing serious matters, which was very important for the development of Ukrainian to be used as a fully functional language, and expressed new ideas about freedom, about solidarity, and so on. But he was also active in the Brotherhood of Saint Cyril and Methodius, which was a political organization. And when the members were arrested in 1847, Shevchenko received the harshest sentence. And in the verdict, we also see this point made that not only did he promote dangerous ideas, but he did so in the Ukrainian language, which made him doubly harmful and dangerous. And the fact that he was very popular could make people think about, I quote, the possibility of Ukraine to exist as a separate state, which sounds very modern, contemporary. And the Tsar himself added to this verdict that he must not be allowed to write or paint. So we see that he is dangerous not only because of his ideas, but because he spread them and was popular, and did so not only in Ukrainian, but also mainly in his poetry in Ukrainian.
Thank you, Ingun, and thank you previous speakers already for giving us this historical context, which I think is very important to understand what is happening today. But let us turn to today, and Guyana. I would like to turn to you. So what's happening now with forcible deportation, indoctrination of Ukrainian children, Ukrainian language? Are there mechanisms of accountability for these actions? How we will deal with securing this accountability?
Thank you, Lila, for the invitation. Before I start talking about specific mechanisms, I want to first talk about the qualification of Russian actions of transferably deporting Ukrainian children and indoctrinating them as violations of international law, because here we are not talking about some questionable policies, and it's not about whether this is just morally correct or not. These actions amount to international crimes, and the gravest international crimes that are of concern to the whole international community. It's already been mentioned that forcible transfer of children is a war crime. So in times of war, the occupied parties may not transfer the population across the borders of the occupied territory to another state. They may only do so in very exceptional circumstances, and such transfer should only be temporary. And that's not the case with the Ukrainian children. As we've heard, they're not only simply taken to the holiday camp for a couple of weeks, they are then indoctrinated, put up for adoption in Ukrainian families. And in fact, the independent UN Commission of Inquiry that is headed by the prominent Norwegian lawyer Erik Mjøse found that forcible transfer of Ukrainian children is a violation of humanitarian law and is a war crime. We've also heard already that these actions take place on a widespread level and have a systematic character, and we can also talk about here then about another category of international crimes, which is crimes against humanity. And these are crimes that usually target civilian population, and they are taking place in an organized manner, systematically on a widespread scale. And there is also an argument to be made for qualifying forcible transfer of Ukrainian children and their indoctrination as genocide. So the crime of genocide is certain acts that are committed with an intent to destroy a national, racial, ethnical, or religious group in whole or in part. And one of the acts that are listed as possible acts of genocide is a forcible transfer of children from one group to another. And why is it one of the acts of genocide? Because yes, it can lead to the erasure of their ethnic, of their identity, national identity, or their ethnical identity. So it's not only by the physical, biological destruction that genocide can happen, it's also by destruction of the culture and national identity. And here the indoctrination of Ukrainian children, so they're subject to reschooling and re-education as Russians, according to Russians' view of the culture, of the history. Their military schooling indicates that Russia wants to raise them as Russians, as part of the national Russian national group, and to make them forget their national identity. Here I would also point out that this situation raises issues not about crimes being committed against Ukrainian children, but the transfer of children also violates the rights of their families, their right to, so taking the children from the families violates the right to respect for family life. It can also amount actually to inhuman treatment of these families, because denying information to the families where the children are causes suffering to the families. We've also heard about degrading conditions of detention in the camps of these children, where they are beaten or bullied if they mention Ukraine or talk about their Ukrainian identity. So what mechanisms exist there? Well, when we talk about responsibility for these international crimes and violations of human rights, I would draw a distinction between responsibility of the individuals and then responsibility of Russia as a state. You may have heard about International Criminal Court. It's an institution that is competent to prosecute all these international crimes that I've mentioned: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And indeed, the ICC, as it is called, already issued arrest warrants against President Putin and against Lvova-Belova, the commissioner for children's rights in Russia, exactly because there are grounds to suspect that they are responsible for committing the war crimes by transferring Ukrainian children from the occupied territories. So I think it sent a very important signal to the world what is going on in Ukraine. Russia is not saving these children. Russia is not protecting the children from the war. Russian leadership is suspected of committing a war crime. What are the prospects of actually seeing these people in the dock in The Hague? They are distant, because we don't have an international police that could just go into Russia and arrest Putin or Lvova-Belova, but it does impose certain limitations on their travels, on their relations with other countries, and most importantly, again, I think it sends an important message in terms of importance of justice and accountability, that these actions are not going to go unpunished, at least. Yeah, so there is a prospect, at least, of eventual accountability, even if international justice is a long project. I think another reason why it is important is in terms of avoiding impunity, because in my opinion, what we see happening now in Ukraine, the crimes committed in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale invasion, is actually a lack of accountability and proper adequate reaction to all the other previous crimes committed by Russian regime in Ukraine and in other countries. There are also some mechanisms available to bringing Russia as a state to responsibility. For example, Ukraine and indeed other states could initiate a case before the International Court of Justice relating to genocide committed by transfer of children. Ukraine has a case against Russia under this genocide convention, but it's not related to Russia's commission of genocide. So this avenue is still open to Ukraine, and indeed I want to emphasize this, that any state party to this convention can bring the issue before the court, accusing or raising the issue of Russia's genocidal actions in respect to Ukrainian children. For some political reasons and previous quite formalistic and strict stance of this court, International Court of Justice, towards Ukrainian complaints, perhaps there is some hesitation on the part of Ukraine to initiate this case, but that's one of the avenues that's still open. There are also international human rights mechanisms where individuals could bring complaint against Russia. For example, in respect of a forcible transfer of children that took place before September 2022, complaints can be brought to the European Court of Human Rights, and that's the date when Russia stopped being part of that system. There is also a human rights committee where some of the Ukrainians have been bringing also claims about human rights violations. Again, it's not such an effective, a strong body at the European Court of Human Rights, but nonetheless, it is very important in principle to record what happened and in principle for justice, to secure justice and have a recognition of the violation of the rights. It's extremely important, crucial for the victims of these crimes. And my third point is that international law does not only talk about accountability of these individuals who commit the crimes or Russia as a state. International law also imposes some obligations on Ukraine, for example, to respect rights of the children and the families that are suffering from this forcible transfers of children. Because Ukraine as a state to whom this territory, occupied territory, belongs, it has this positive obligation to take actions to prevent the transfers and to return the children. And of course, in practice, this is difficult. There are objective limitations. There is a war going on, and in law, it's also well recognized that there are limitations on states' responsibility. But nonetheless, there is an expectation and an obligation, in fact, on Ukraine to do everything within its measures, everything within its ability to take, for example, diplomatic measures to negotiate return of the children, but also to provide assistance to those families and children who have returned and support them in this process of reintegration. And last but not least, if we are talking about qualifying these actions of forcible transfer of children as genocide, that imposes an obligation on all the state parties to Genocide Convention to prevent the crimes of genocide, especially when the states see that there is a risk of these crimes being committed. And that obligation varies depending on the circumstances and depending on the state. But in my view, I think Norway here in a special position because in one of its judgments, the ICJ said that the capacity of the state to prevent genocide depends also on the links that the state has with actors that are involved in commission of these crimes. And I come from the University of Tromsø. We had a speech recently by Prime Minister of Norway, who again emphasized the special relationship between Norway and Russia. He said again, Norway is one of the neighbors, Russian neighbors, who has never been attacked. Well, my response to that is, if Norway is in such a special position in a relationship to Russia, why not use that special position and links to prevent the international crimes that are taking place in Ukraine?
Thank you, Gayana. And I would like also to give a floor to you, Julia, because you've been studying children's rights, and I wanted to ask you how the fact that those crimes are being committed against children influence the gravity of the crimes. And you also wrote on the on the qualifying this act as an act of genocide. So.
Yeah, thank you to Gayane for an excellent overview of this topic. So just to know that children are recognized generally in law as a special category because of certain vulnerabilities, and Gayane already mentioned that in IHL, which is international humanitarian law that is applied in armed conflict, children are recognized as special group of civilian population. So civilian population generally is protected. There is a general prohibition on deporting them, but particularly children, and if they are deported, then there can be deported only in exceptional circumstances and only for certain reasons, like medical reasons or emergencies. And they actually, there are special rights like right to education, so education in their culture, language, etc. should be, even if it's a true evacuation, it should continue, and there are special obligations with regard to family reunification and family life. And Gayane mentioned already that, of course, family life is very important for adults, but it's particularly important for children because children depend on adults for their development and forming into a full-fledged human being and a citizen of a society. So family life is very important, and there are strong obligations of family reunification in international humanitarian law. But we also have this big content of international human rights obligations that also function at the same time. And one of the most strongest protection of children is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which both Russia and Ukraine are parties to. And we can say quite confidently that many of its provisions are, and it's, as Gayane said, it's not controversial, they're clearly violated by this practice. There are multiple provisions with regard to family life, right to liberty, prohibition from inhuman treatment, right to education, right to play. But there is also one very important provision, Article 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which protects right to identity. And it's interesting that this actually article was introduced by this famous organization from Argentina, Grandmothers de Plaza de Mayo. So there was, in a way, a comparable situation where children were kidnapped and adopted during the military dictatorship, and grandmothers tried to reconnect with their grandchildren that were abducted. Their names were changed and they were brought up in different families. So they brought up this, they argued and advocated and campaigned a lot to bring this provision of Article 8, and I think for Ukrainian children this is a central provision of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, unfortunately, for example, the committee of the convention, which is responsible for monitoring the state parties and how they deal with the obligations, every 4 years they have a review of obligation. And actually, Russia was under review recently, January, February last year. And the question of forcible transfer of Ukrainian children was raised, and it was a central issue. However, Russian response was just, well, a combination of denial and gaslighting, and saying that no one is sent, denying to provide a list of names, and saying that the children are not adopted, in fact, and everyone misunderstands Russian procedures. However, again, even this response is a clear violation of international obligations, because even if children are evacuated, there is an obligation to provide list of names. Everything should be recorded. There's strict family reunification provisions. So even denying providing the list of these children is a huge problem. And an interesting part in all this discussion is, and forcible transfer, is that actually if you read Russian, Russia is not actually hiding any of the evidence of what they're doing. Even though they're saying that they're not adopting, actually the website of Lvova-Belova says that how many children were adopted in which region. And similarly, the regional organization just posted on their websites and social media platforms. So they're not hiding it at all if you have language skills sort of to research it. So unfortunately, I mean, the Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a very critical report, but there is not a lot that they can do with regard to response to it. I think one avenue that Ukraine and the Ukrainian parents have been also using is qualifying children as missing persons. So there are a number of UN institutions that help with missing children, missing people more generally, but children in this case can be qualified as such because they're separated from their families. The names are changed, and there is no contact with these children. In terms of just connecting it to forcible transfers as genocide, I think it's. I agree with Gaëlle. It would be a positive step to have some kind of international adjudication on this point. If not Ukraine, but someone else could bring this claim of violation of Article 2E of the Genocide Convention. There is also, as Gaëlle mentioned, the International Court of Justice approaches the question of genocide quite strictly, and not only with regard to Ukraine, but generally in jurisprudence. So there is a question, because it's interpreted very narrowly in terms of biological destruction of this ethnic group, and there is a question in terms of, because children are forcibly transferred and thankfully not killed, that there is no biological destruction. However, again, there is a question of future generations, and if Russian numbers are correct, it's 10% of all Ukrainian children that are forcibly transferred to Russia. So I think there's a good argument for Ukraine to make that it might be genocide. But one other issue is that actually, even though, as we discussed, forcible transfer is, unfortunately, has been a common occurrence, not only in Ukrainian context, but historically in other countries, there are not a lot of cases, both in national courts and international courts, on forcible transfers. So that would be a test case in some way to look how actually a court, international court, can decide on this issue. And I think it can be important. Of course, it will be important for Ukraine, but it also might clarify a lot of points in international law, genocide studies, and children's rights for other jurisdictions. And of course, beyond international courts, states in domestic courts can use universal jurisdiction to try and adjudicate these claims. And we know already that several countries, Germany, Lithuania, others, adjudicating for crimes committed in Ukraine by Russia, international crimes. I haven't seen any forcible transfer cases, but that's an avenue, a promising avenue, if international courts wouldn't work out.
Thank you, Julia. So there are different mechanisms to try to safeguard accountability, and Ukraine is trying to use different mechanisms, right? But I just wanted to follow up with a question on this special tribunal, because there was something that Ukraine would like to see. If you could elaborate, would it also impact what we are talking about now? Would it help in any way? If you...
Yeah, the Ukraine has been advocating for establishment of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression, which is the crime of attacking another or using force by one state against another state in breach of prohibition of use of force in international law. I don't think that forcible transfer of children directly falls within the definition of the crime, but I think it's important in the sense that it brings accountability for those acts of starting the war or full-scale invasion that then leads to the occupation and all the other crimes that follow with the active hostilities.
I think it's very important in this time that we say clearly who is aggressor is and who started, especially now. So I think the question of special tribunal should be very high on the table. Not only for Ukraine, obviously, but I think for every country.
But if we are touching on this point on what is happening now, yeah, I think it's very important because, in my opinion, we witnessed the erosion of the rules protecting the state territory and sovereignty, especially since the full-scale invasion. And I think the rhetoric, Trump's rhetoric on Greenland or Panama Canal is kind of the consequence of that failure to bring accountability for one state taking the territory of another state by force. So in that sense, I think it's very important.
Yeah, and before we open up for questions, just one last thing. I would like to follow up on Holodomor, which was already mentioned, because we were talking a lot about historical roots of Russia's current policy towards Ukraine. And Holodomor, it was a man-made famine that occurred in Soviet Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. Millions of Ukrainians died from starvation due to harsh policies by Soviet government under Stalin. It was both forced collectivizations, grain requisitioning, and also confiscation of food. And Holodomor has been recognized as a genocide by the European Parliament, some other institutions, and also over 35 national parliaments, both both in Europe and beyond. And actually many recognitions have taken place since 2022. So I would like to ask this panel, what do you think is the significance of these recognitions in this historical perspective in the current circumstances?
I could go first. I think, legally speaking, it's important to mention that when Holodomor took place, the term of genocide and this concept of crime of genocide didn't exist yet. It's actually Holodomor and some of the persecution of minorities in the Ottoman Empire that in a way led Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who worked with this concept, to develop the concept of this crime that aims to destroy group physically, but also destroy its culture. So I just want to specify that these recognitions, they have in a way political significance, but I think they are also very important in our context in the sense of how important it is to actually understand the context and what is happening in the country, what is happening in Ukraine. What does Russia mean when they say denazification? It's not about Nazi parties of use in Ukraine, it's actually about de-Ukrainization. It's an attack on Ukrainian identity. And I think this recognition of Holodomor so many years later is a way in a call to look closer to what is going on in Ukraine. What is Russia doing with Ukrainian children? How is Russia treating Ukrainian culture in the occupied territories? And to give the actions and events that are taking place their correct qualification and correct names.
If I may follow up on what Gayane said, I think it's, I agree it's mostly a political action recognition, but I think it's also a recognition of imperial undertones and motives of Russian invasion, because as Gayane said, we have evidence that, for example, Raphael Lemkin, who came up with this term of genocide, he actually was unfortunately inspired by Holodomor, and there is a famous speech he's done on Holodomor specifically, and we also know from his writings and researching the history of how he came to the convention that was adopted by the state, is that he actually wrote quite a lot on colonial genocides, and even with the Holocaust, he considered it as partially motivated by imperialist ambitions and subjugating minorities. So a lot of his research preceding the convention was about thinking about it in terms of colonial crime. However, when the great powers were at the negotiating table, the colonial language was excluded, and the Soviet Union and also the US, the Canada, a lot of countries specifically sort of cut it out because of their own treatment of indigenous people or minorities. And there is this famous quote from Lemkin that he tried so hard for this convention, but it was a modest and a timid convention in terms of what he actually wanted to include it. So to me, this recognitions, they are political, but I think it's also a recognition that that these countries understand the imperial nature of Russia's actions now.
Yeah, I think at this point in our modern history, it's very important to think back to what were the roots of the international law rules which we have in place, and how they were actually shaped by the interest of different states, of course, as well. And I always think about Norway, because I've heard it many times that most important weapon of Norway is international law. And I think that it applies to any state nowadays. So yes, so I would like to open for discussion and open for questions from the audience, as well as questions online, if there are any. So there is a microphone which will be passed.
Thank you very much. I have a question. I hope it's not too much on the side, but I was intrigued by Ingun's comment that in Ukraine you can speak Russian for free and you cannot, or freely, but you cannot do that in Russia. So the question is about language. What do you think would happen in post-war Ukraine with the Russian language in terms of Ukrainian families who speak this as their mother's and father's tongue? And I'm not talking about the Russian propaganda of Ukrainians being Russians, because that's the problem here. It's so politicized. So what's your thoughts on that?
I can start. So what Ukrainian sociologists and sociolinguists have researched and shown is that since 2014, also earlier, but especially since 2014 and even more since 2022, many Ukrainians have switched from using Russian as perhaps their family language or the language they use at home to using Ukrainian. Now, it's very important to know that and to think of that it's not a question of using just one language or just the other language. Ukrainians are multilingual, or they are at least bilingual. But this has been a very clear tendency, and there have been two tendencies actually. One is to, if you are asked, what is your mother tongue? I think about 83% say Ukrainian. But still, if you go back 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there would be more people speaking Russian, perhaps at home, but still saying that, well, my mother tongue is Ukrainian. So you have all kinds of nuances here which are different, but the main tendency is that very many people have switched to using, from using perhaps Russian as their first language or the family language to using Ukrainian, and also many writers have done the same, which is quite dramatic for a writer who uses the language on that level to also switch to Ukrainian. So what is happening? So, I mean, again, you have statistics on the one hand, and then you have all the individual stories on the other hand. I would like to recommend in this context an essay by Sasha Dozhik, describing this transition, but also describing the circumstances and the context in which this transition took place for her as one individual, and this gives a lot of insights and nuances to that question. I have heard here in Bergen young Ukrainian mothers speaking Russian to each other. They had probably been doing that for a long time, but when they approached or spoke to their children, they used Ukrainian because that's the language of the future. That is one, I think, tendency, but there are so many nuances here. It is really difficult to predict what will happen with Russian, but I think this tendency will just continue. Again, the political question is of course important, so it depends on what is happening, and Ukraine is a big country, so there might be differences here, and I'm sure my colleagues will add nuances as well to the question.
I guess I can add a personal anecdote. I completely agree. There are many people who transferred into Ukrainian completely voluntarily. There are still people who keep speaking at home in Russian. But again, being bilingual, at least in Kiev, where my family is basically a lot of people would speak whatever language they speak. And I traveled last year to Ukraine on train from Lviv to Kiev, and I've heard people speaking both Ukrainian and Russian. It's very common in Ukraine. One person speaks in Russian, the other answers in Ukrainian. That's still happening. Definitely there is, in Kiev, which was a bilingual city, and there were you would hear a lot of Russian. there are more Ukrainian, but still people speak Russian, people speak Russian at home. It didn't seem to me like that was a major political issue, especially for people. I think it's generational as well. I'm at home still speaking Russian because most of my family grew up in Soviet Union, where they were not able to study Ukrainian because of everything we discussed. So they still speak Russian at home, but at work they speak in Ukrainian. I think there is more tendency now to switch actually to Ukrainian, and if someone is speaking Ukrainian, especially if someone is a survivor of the war, of occupation, just to be polite and thoughtful about potentially trauma, etc.
Other questions?
Thank you for very interesting perspectives of this. I was wondering, when you look at the international situation, particularly international law these days, you can become a bit pessimistic. Do you expect the international legal system to be resilient enough for to be able to help these Ukrainian children in the future, or do you fear that it will, erode?
Thank you for your question. I think international law system already showed its relevance and importance because if you look 100 years ago, we didn't have the rules that said doing this, transferring children, is unlawful and there are consequences to it, or this is a genocide and there are consequences to it, or you cannot attack a country and take territories by force. So I think it's easy to neglect the achievement of international law that we have already in our modern world. There are, of course, weaknesses of international law, and enforcement is one of its biggest weaknesses. And the fact that it's so intertwined with politics and force, it's also one of its weaknesses. The good way in which international law worked in Ukraine is that we had an arrest warrant from the ICC. It said, look, these people are suspected war criminals, and we as an international criminal court have enough evidence to issue arrest warrant against them. And I think that's crucial in the situation of Ukraine, to galvanize the support from other partners and to send clear signals to the world what is going on in Ukraine. So the result of this, among other things, I think the creation of the coalition, international coalition for the return of children, where more than 40 states participate and work together with Ukraine in different directions, evidence gathering, investigations where these children are, cooperating on returning them, providing assistance afterwards. So yeah, it doesn't work in a direct way that you can come to Russia and say, look, this is a violation, stop it, because the force disregards the law and it's not that uncommon, but it works in the way that it actually creates a reaction and collective reaction and effort in response to these crimes.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting panel and discussion. I have a question. It's a little bit on the side, but it might be a kind of a conclusion. What do you, that have the finger in the hot water now, think about the attack from Donald Trump on Zelensky and Ukraine? How will that forge Ukrainian resistance? Will it hurt it very much? I mean, I'm talking internally in Ukraine. Or will it make the Ukrainians more resilient to this kind of attacks? Thank you.
Start with some personal reflection. I think the first days of Trump attacking Zelensky, everybody was shocked, also Ukrainians as well. But I think on the third day, when Trump called him dictator and all these things, what I saw on Twitter and what I had an impression is that Ukrainians actually gathered, and the message was, well, you cannot offend our president. It's our president, so who can actually criticize him? It's us, and we are doing good job with that. So no questions, right? So in my just personal opinion, it kind of also brought people a bit together, I think, and also an understanding that, well, we need external support, but the most important is that we stay together also as a society. So that would be my immediate reflection on the questions. I don't know if
just to briefly intervene as well. I think it's also in a way will show a response to this narrative that was quite dominant. That Ukraine-Russia war is a proxy war of the U.S. And my usually argument to that was, well, as we discussed today, Russia attacked Ukraine for centuries, even before the U.S. existed as a country. So, of course, it would be great to have a support of Western allies, but I think Ukrainians won't stop fighting and won't stop trying to return the children any way possible. Again, the example of Vitaly that Lilia mentioned in the very beginning, this child was returned because of local NGOs, a mother who went and get the child back. So I don't think it will influence as much anything with regard to the policies on the ground.
Any other reflections? Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question about the numbers that you mentioned for the forcibly deported children, and we heard they vary a lot, from 10,000s to several hundred thousands. And from your knowledge of the situation, what do you think is what is your best estimate? How many children are affected?
Well, as I've mentioned, there are different numbers. Again, if you want to see something that there is documentation, etc., I think the Ukrainian number of 20,000, that's definitely a number of children that were deported. But I actually think that the numbers that are quoted by Russia are probably more true, that they are in 100,000s, especially if you count not only children that were separated from the families, but also the entire families that were deported to Russia. If you count all those children, I think the number is in 100,000.
Just one comment on numbers, not necessarily in respect of forcible transfer, but I often see this, kind of statistics, how many civilians were killed, or often how many military personnel was killed on Ukrainian side and then on the Russian. But then I also have to think, well, these numbers on Ukrainian side, you can say this is part of the army, military personnel, it's normal, but most of those people, they were actually civilians before 2022, So they should not have been killed if not the Russia attacked Ukraine. So to compare these numbers, I think they're also uncomparable, because those were civilians who had to stand up and to fight for their country. That's just a side note on numbers.
And one more about Mariupol. We still don't really know the exact numbers of people who were killed, because it's still occupied, and we have different numbers that people who were there, they named many more people who were died, and it's still a question how many children were deported from this region.
Thank you. I would also like to commend the panel. It's been really excellent and interesting. And I was also glad that the colonial aspect was brought up, because Russia is certainly a colonial state. It's kind of almost ingrained in the culture. Then there are also historically and currently other colonial states, or states with colonial ambitions. And speaking about international law, the most important anti-colonial decision was the ruling of the International Court of Justice in July last year on the illegal occupation of Palestine. What is interesting is also the voting in the General Assembly in September on the case, where 124 states voted in favor, supporting the judgment, and also on some following up recommendations. And then there were 14 states voting against. And then there were other states which declined to have an opinion, abstaining from the vote. States like Denmark with Greenland, Canada, Panama. I guess you're hearing what I'm saying. And then, unfortunately, also Ukraine. So do you have a comment on that particular point? I know, of course, a difficult situation of Ukraine, but has this been discussed in any way? Has this been criticized? That's my question.
I can start. I think there are a lot of, I see your point and I take your point, but I've seen a lot of discussion and a lot of this kind of questions posed on Ukrainian and Ukrainian government, but I personally do not think it's fair, because not only Palestinians, but for example, other regions that were oppressed by Russia, for example, some Kazakhs activists were saying that Ukraine should lead the decolonization effort against Russia, which I think would be great, but I think it's completely ignores the realities of the war right now. Ukraine is in active war and is relying on its Western allies, and without the support of Western allies, Ukraine wouldn't be able to continue fighting without these resources. So I'm not sure if it's fair to ask Ukraine, because it is in the position of survival, or whether the nation will survive, to also care about other good causes equally, because it now is fighting for its existence.
Selling out the principle for weapons, right?
But I'm sure you understand that it's informed by political decisions that U.S., as I assume, voted against this resolution. So Ukraine abstained in order to avoid giving an opinion that's in contradiction with the allies who support the war effort. But I also would note that, again, totally take your point with regard to Palestine. But when we talk about generally imperialism, what I have found, especially in the research area I do international law, maybe again I will correct me if I'm wrong, is that we actually hear and read a lot about Western imperialism of the US, imperialism of Britain. It's very well documented, criticized, and I think it's definitely fair, and we do need to do work on this, but Russian imperialism or Chinese imperialism is very much overlooked in the literature. So I think that was also one of our attempts to sort of see Russia as also a colonial power, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in some parts of the world that Russia is a liberator of people. So that's what we were trying to show in this discussion as well.
If I may add, I think I wish the states always had a principled position, but that's obviously their choices and votes are informed by their politics. And I wish Ukraine had ratified the Rome Statute much earlier. That would have always also been a more principled position. But I also don't think we should be, if we go down that road, we can then put questions to any state. Why has Norway ratified Kampala agreements? Isn't that a principled position? Well done for Norway for having a principled position on Palestine and Gaza, absolutely. But Norway is also, Norway's choices, Denmark's choices, they are also dictated by the politics. And I think it's good to have experts, academics that can absolutely raise this issue, but there is only a limited extent to which we can affect politics of our countries.
Yeah, first, thank you for a very interesting and, of course, also shocking situation about these children. What I want to ask you is, do you know anything about Putin's personal involvement in this political kidnapping of children? Because I think I've read that it has been used his personal planes to deport them to Russia. So if you know anything about that, thank you.
Yes, if you don't mind. Yes, there is a clear Putin's involvement. Yes, there were reports that his planes were used for deportation, but also there is on his own website and on the website of Maria Lvova-Belova, there are multiple photos of him meeting her, talking about these children. He actually, a lot of passportization that these children get in Russian citizenship, which means that then it's easier to adopt them, were done by presidential decree. So one of those meetings, initial in 2022, between Maria Lvova-Belova and Putin, it was an official meeting that was well documented. There are official photos where he signs this decree to save these children, to make it easier for them to adopt Russian citizenship. And there was another decree last year where he, by his own decree, can grant Russian citizenship to these children. So he is very much involved.
Yeah, and the decision from the International Criminal Court where the arrest warrant was issued against Putin directly because he either committed through other people the forcible transfer of children, or as a superior he witnessed it and didn't stop it, even though it was within his powers. So even from the legal perspective, international criminal law, he is seen as one of the perpetrators of this crime through other people.
There is a question from the digital audience. As I understand it, the question goes, if the Ukraine didn't evacuate population before the Russian occupation and Russia evacuates them from a dangerous territory, how can they be criticized?
Shall we start the panel from the beginning?
Yes, with regard to evacuation, there is, of course, circumstances where evacuation are totally legitimate and legal. So in war, it is generally deportations are prohibited, but evacuation is possible. But there are some strict conditions. There should be a specific reason. So there should be a medical emergency or for the security reasons, and the evacuation should be temporary. So it cannot be for infinitely deported. But we see with, for example, with adoptions, with the granting citizenship, it's definitely not temporary. And there are also very strict conditions, especially as we discussed with regard to children, that they have to receive education in their language, in their culture. There should be specific identity cards filled in that are shared with International Red Cross Committee, so that there's family reunification, is the connection between family and the child is supported, and the family reunification is achieved as soon as possible. None of those conditions are met by Russia. So from the legal point of view, I don't think you can justify it as legal evacuation. But also to mention that Ukraine did try to evacuate citizens from occupied territories. There were, in fact, a number of orphanages and boarding schools that were evacuated in advance. But again, because of how the war started, and Ukrainian population until the very last minute was hoping that there will be no full-scale invasion. So there were some limitations. And also, as you know, even when the war started, Ukraine tried to arrange humanitarian corridors and evacuate people, but they were bombed or blocked, so it was impossible to evacuate them.
Just one thought about evacuation. Even if you would know this will happen in a few days, and Russians' plan was to take all of Ukraine within 3 days. Where do you take 40 million people, and where would you evacuate them? It's just a comment.
Yes. Thank you for really enlightening and very, very, very important panel. It was so interesting to listen to all of you. Thank you so much. I just have one question, because I think the legal expert here mentioned some kind of state organization that tries to address the situation of children being evacuated. So I was just wondering, what kind of legal strategies have they chosen to address this issue? Can you explain a little bit more? Is there anything that should be highlighted in terms of the strategies that can be used to address this issue of children and families?
I think that's it's called the International Coalition for Return of Children, and it's headed by Ukrainian government and Canadian government, and it's over 40 states that are parties to it, including Norway. And I think they work in a lot of different directions. So they have a legal task force, so it's a group of experts who work on different mechanisms, but not only accountability, but also I guess different regulations about what happens if the children are returned, what kind of assistance they can get from the state, etc. I would expect that they're also engaged in collecting of evidence and investigations of who perpetrates, who is involved in the transfer of children, etc. So they, from what I understand, they work in a lot of different directions on accountability of also the international level, collecting of evidence, etc. But also about they work with technological development, using technology to trace children, developing a DNA database to be able to identify these children because their names are then changed, etc. Perhaps Julia, you could add.
Well, the part of it is also sanctions, personal sanctions. Many states did sanction Putin and Lvova-Belova, but I think because of all this work done by the coalition, but also by independent researchers. For example, there is a Yale Humanitarian Observatory. They publish a number of research on this particular issue. They have access to geolocation and geospatial data, and that's how we know that there are these 43 re-education camps. So they collect this data, and they collect the data with regard to particular perpetrators, even on the lower levels, so heads of orphanages, mayors of the cities, so because all of them are involved, because it's a federal organized system in Russia on all levels of government. So this information is collected, and recently, for example, UK sanctioned 10 additional people, EU sanctioned additional people over lower ranks in Russia, and I think that's also very useful because, and maybe the most effective strategy to prevent further forcible transfers, because I think, well, it seems Putin doesn't really care about the sanctions or arrest warrant, but the local mayor who can't now go to Europe or the UK might think twice of whether to participate in this scheme.
And actually another strategy they have been working on is to trace, to show that Belarus and Belarusian officials are also involved in the transfer of children that are children who are taken from the occupied territories in Ukraine and then further sent to these sort of rehabilitation camps and schoolings in Belarus.
Hi, thank you for your very good panel. I have a question that comes from my lack of imagination. So whenever peace happens, if I understand correctly, it's not that, I mean, buildings will stop being destroyed, people will stop being killed, but the issue of forced transfer will not be solved. Like even if they stop constantly actively transferring, what happens with the kids that have already been transferred? So as I understand it, it will be a continuous breach, let's say, like we need to fix that situation and take it back to the position where we were before the aggression. But I can't imagine how that looks like. Is it like actively Ukrainizing these children? Is it giving them the choice? Maybe some of them have become adults, maybe. Can you actually give a choice if you have been indoctrinated? So how are like more than legal, like what are the like social, historical, linguistic way to make this a happy ending, if that could be something that we can talk about in this context?
Well, unfortunately, when we talked about the gaps of international law, I think one of the gaps of international law is actually there is no precise mechanism of how to return those children. And even though there are all these initiatives to try to identify them and return them, international law doesn't have an answer. And there is an argument to make that the whole idea of forcibly transferring all those children is for Putin to use the negotiations as a bargaining chip to return children in, for example, in return for territory, etc. So there is a big question. I think you raised a really good point. It is a very complicated issue, both legally but also just socially, psychologically, and it wouldn't be easy to solve. I think Ukraine is now looking at the experience of other countries. I mentioned Argentina. They went through this. There is now the DNA registry, for example, is established. There will be cases where, for example, a baby was transferred and potentially they did get a nice family, it's possible, somewhere in Russia, and never knew that they were Ukrainian and integrated. And I think that those were cases also in Argentina. Some children actually wanted to find their families, but some actually really loved their adoptive parents. And that still, as I understand, there's a lot of tension societally because of this issue, because in Argentina, the government decided to prioritize right to truth over the best interest of the child. Here, Ukraine will be under the same pressures, and also there is an additional interest of the nation and continuation of nation to exist in conflict with, for example, best interest of the child, if we will give an opportunity for children to choose to stay in Russia. So there are obviously conflict of rights and interests, and there is a long road to solve this. For now, from what I understand from Ukrainian officials, is that the position is to return all children, starting this DNA registry and working on collecting samples from family members. But there is not yet legislation in terms of compulsory DNA testing. Also, there's a question of how to make it compulsory if it's in Russia, in another state. So in Argentina, the circumstances were a little bit different because it was within one state.
Just wanted to comment on this question, because we were talking so much about the history, right? And then how, for instance, Ukrainian was banned, people were transferred, and so on. And I think Ingun mentioned that it's remarkable that Ukrainians survived. I mean, language, all this, deportations and repressions. And we also heard that this Russification policy led to many people, for instance, speaking Russian at work, but still continue speaking Ukrainian. So it kind of gives hope, because nobody was forced to speak Ukrainian, for these years of independence. So this, you mentioned Ukrainization. I don't think it will be a strategy. Well, now you have to, study this and learn back what you missed. But I think importance of teaching history will be very important to give these children or adults a choice to learn more. And I think this will also should work. But of course, it's difficult to imagine, but it gives us hope. I think looking at the historical perspective, also that Ukrainians managed to build a state, and actually they value it so much that they stand up to the biggest country in the world to protect it and to protect the right to speak their language, even if their parents maybe could not speak it for during their lifetime, because they were raised and they lived under the Soviet Union, for instance. So and this gives us hope. And I also think it's a good time maybe to wrap up. Thanks to your very active involvement into our discussion, we went a bit over time, but it's not a problem. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today, also online. And as Ukraine fights to protect itself against Russia's full-scale invasion, I think we need to remember that this is not a one-time event, right? This is a part of continuous policy against Ukraine, and it is important it is also treated as such, right? It's not only for safeguarding accountability for these grave crimes committed, but also for any attempts to stop the aggressor and protect Ukrainians, but also to protect Europe, because he threatens also the rest of the world. So let's give a round of applause for our panelists, and please support Ukraine.